So, those of you who know Dan, you'll be able to recognise that I'm not Dan. Dan is stepping into the pedagogy panel to help out because one of the papers cancelled and he's got a pedagogy project that he can talk about. So, Dan's over there, I'm chairing this. Luckily, I have seen all the videos, so hopefully it will work. So just to, well, you've all got programs, so I don't really need to do this, but Joe Bates, Georgia Denham and Leon Clowes are all here. Hopefully you've seen all the videos and you know what they're going to talk about. We'll start with a familiar format by now of 5 minute sort of précis to start with, and then the discussion afterwards. Do you want to go second or third, depending on how quickly we? Are you ready to?
Yeah, we're ready to go. Yeah.
You ready for the audio as well?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. So, Joe,
you could also kick us off the mics as well, please.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, there I am.
Thank you.
Talking without the microphone. Sorry. Welcome to the session. So we're going to start with Joe, then Georgia, and then Leon, and we're going to have 5 minutes with each one of them, and then I'll start asking some questions and ask you to ask some as well.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you all. I'm Joe. So I'm here to talk about tuning in electronic music and my experience thereof, and this thing that I've built to help me. My talk kind of started with a very potted history of temperament and focused on the kind of emergence of 12-tone equal temperament as this hegemonic tuning system in the 20th century that was kind of extended through kind of colonial and commercial forces to become this worldwide hegemony that ended up influencing a huge number of the electronic tools that we use and that we're familiar with. It's still a fairly hegemonic system, but in recent years there has been a lot of work done to allow for different types of tuning and intonation in electronic music. This has been done by kind of enthusiastic microtonalists, by people working in intonations from other cultures who want to be able to perform their music using electronic instruments. There's kind of a decolonizing force there that's an important part of that recent history. The thing that I've been focusing on, though, is that while a lot of this software is very powerful and can do some amazing things, and I've used it a lot in my music, it is almost always tunes for you. When you play most instruments, kind of instruments that aren't fretted or keyboarded, tuning is a vital part of your practice. It's what you're doing as you play. All notes are tuned on many instruments, free pitch instruments or instruments like woodwind instruments, where the pitch is guided by the makeup of the instrument, but you still have a lot of tuning left to do. Whereas with electronic musician, the process of pitch tuning is automated. It's done for you. And this makes the experience of writing microtonally for electronic instruments very different from that of the experience of players playing acoustic instruments. And this has been really conspicuous to me as a composer working in notated media when I write on electronics, where I have the tuning done for me, and then I give them to a player who is doing the tuning for themselves. And we have this very different experience of the tuning. And so this little device that I've built is in part a way to try and give me a new experience, a different way of tuning, particularly as a pianist, and actually as a flautist as well. I don't have an open-keyed flute, open-holed flute, so my tuning options are less. I have less flexibility there. So I'm on neither of those instruments tuning as I go along. In my talk, I kind of focused on 4 pieces of writing about tuning, one of whom is by Mira Benjamin, who is here among us, to my slight intimidation. So the first was by Hayam Alami, a Iraqi-British composer, oud player, technologist, who writes about distinguishing between a kind of a scalic logic of pitch and relational knowledge of pitch. And he observes, I think really pertinently, that a lot of the current microtonal solutions available in electronic music are scalic. And by this he means that they present a kind of a linear order of arranged pitches with no inbuilt sense of the relationships between those pitches. They also tend towards kind of viewing what you get as a complete set. So you're given this kind of huge number of notes to play with. Richard James, aka Fixed Twin, describes them as, all of these Hertz numbers, right? All of these kind of discrete pitches. Whereas he prefers to view intonation and argues that in most non-Western contexts, this is how intonation is viewed, as larger relational sets where there's all these kind of relationships that make up a big web of intonation from which you're choosing smaller subsets. And he's built some really useful software based on that. Another really important scholar in this was Mark Sabat, who looks at different types of intervals. And he distinguishes between consonant tunables, dissonant tunables, and non-tunables. And one of the things I've noticed about most electronic media is that it makes all notes feel the same. All these different types of relationships become identical, become flattened. Mira, in her work on tuning, distinguishes really usefully between microtonality and intonation as mutually beneficial ways of knowing pitch. Viewing microtonality as this kind of conceptual and symbolic way of considering pitch, whereas intonation as a kind of embodied practice. And again, most of the electronic solutions available tend towards the microtonal and steer you away from the intonational. So this instrument is designed to address some of those things. It's, I think, relational. You have these 4 different oscillators, and to tune them, you have to listen to the way that they interact with one another. It creates complex relationships where some intervals are harder to tune than others because you're having to use your ear to find them. And it's intonational in the way that your interaction with the instrument is continually shaping the pitch that you're making, rather than a matter of kind of setting up the pitch and then executing it afterwards. The final scholar worth mentioning is Dmitry Tomochko, whose work on kind of symmetry has played a really major role in making all of the different oscillators track each other. So you can make one control another and go in parallel or contrary motion, which creates really interesting forms of symmetry, which are otherwise super hard to audiate. So for example, you can get a tritone really easily because it's symmetrical within the octave, even though it can be really difficult to accurately tune a tritone. So yeah, that's kind of a run through of the ideas behind this. I realize I haven't played it at all, I haven't touched it at all, but perhaps I'll leave that till after other people's introductions because I've gone a little long.
Hello, everyone. I'm Georgia Denham, and so some of you at this point may have seen my talk, and others of you may not have done, because it only arrived with Paul Simon on Thursday night. And in a sort of meta extended way, this illustrates the sort of purpose of my talk, which is just to discuss how a composer, how a person can be affected by having to transition tools that they use, how they transition software. And the particular example I was thinking about is my transition from using notation software, which is my sort of daily workstation, daily thing as a composer, working in traditional notation. And I had to change those tools quite abruptly because of licensing changes. And the impact it had on my life was really significant. The impact it had on my creative productivity, the impact it had on my mental health, it was pretty vast. And it's the kind of conversation that composers have at the pub about how crappy it is how crappy Dorico is at the moment, how crappy Sibelius is at the moment, and have you heard about this update recently? But when I was going and kind of navigating that change, the thing that made me start thinking about it a lot more seriously was I was moving house at the same time, and I was sort of moving house and moving software and thought, there's a lot of parallels here, but there's also a great deal of difference in the support and understanding that is available for those two things. So if the example I use in my talk is you're moving house, you go on Google and you're like, right, how do I move house? And there's a wealth of resources and kind of ideas, very, very practical, very accessible on how early you should start packing boxes and all the different things you might need to consider. There's also a really, really great wealth of resource for people with differences, for disability, for neurodivergence, those kinds of things, because it's a much more commonly shared experience. But then if you do the same thing to try and move softwares, you get some Reddit threads and maybe some of the companies themselves talking about individual things in their software, but nothing really is a holistic framework. And by the nature of being a composer on your own, working on your own, you're kind of left to your own devices. So, yeah, and it causes a lot of disruption and chaos and preparing the talk and being in this format and in a conference setting, not my world at all. You know, I write concert music, and so doing this was like mega stressful. And it reminded me of being in my undergrad at conservatoire, where everyone has to write one essay a year and then all the Beethoven books are gone. And everyone's kind of calling around going, have you got the one on string quartets? I need that one. I need to check a reference. And I was feeling like I was trying to impersonate a researcher trying to do this. And eventually my partner, who's a complete researcher in a completely different environment, he was like, Georgia, I think you just need to just talk about your own experience, and you don't need to worry about referencing. Like, you don't need to worry about referencing, but like not Harvard referencing, and like just do your thing, be a composer, that's who you are. You don't have to pretend that you're a musicologist right now. And that was a big relief. But then I also had Eurovision tickets, so there was another delay. I told Simon, I've got to be transparent, you know, I could be on TV and they're just like, oh, Georgia Denham's there, she hasn't sent me her paper. So you can see the real disruption that was sort of happening. And that's what happens when people move softwares. Oh, and in case you haven't caught up, I don't know if I've said this, I have ADHD, which is kind of another big part of the talk and the presentation is about how these changes are difficult for everybody, but when you have some kind of neurodiversity, some kind of difference, a disability, if you're hearing impaired, if you're visually impaired, the resources being so disparate and so variable means that it's not consistently accessible for everyone. And it made, so I'm really grateful to be here to kind of share that perspective, although a little bit chaotically. But yeah, that's me.
I've actually scripted mine because I would seriously go off point and start talking about astrological star signs or something if otherwise. So you can thank me later. Okay, so my presentation, Can You Teach an Old Gay New Tricks, considers if there is value in revisiting past lived traumas of several decades previous and how a DIY ethos might or might not be recaptured using a basic digital audio workstation. This it is the beginning of a music practice research process, and I ask if a Deleuzian concept of repetition provides insight on learned behaviours and how my practice development may be analysed using Zagorski-Thomas's framework of artistic, pragmatic and activist categorisation. As an isolated gay teenager during the moral hysteria surrounding the AIDS crisis, I coped by making electro-pop songs on a Tascam Porter 1 4-track cassette machine, a polyphonic Elka synth and a Boss drum machine. The queer popular music I identified at the time was released through Some Bizarre Records, an outsider label that allowed left-field artists to achieve high production values. In my interviewing of musicians Jim Thirlwell and David Ball, I asked them about their production techniques of the early 1980s. Two elements that they described I had read about from interviews in music magazines at the time, and I'd accordingly applied these ideas to my own home demo recordings. Dave Ball's first instrument was a guitar, and he did not use sequencers in Soft Cell's recordings, always playing live on the duo's 1980s output. Thirlwell, in his early compositions, would adjust the tape speed to create eerie and sometimes painful sounds through this detuning. I utilised live playing and detuning regularly in my home recordings. So, re-emerging as a transdisciplinary artist in my early 50s, it took several years to rebuild confidence in using the technological tools now available for music making. So I made a half-hearted attempt how to use Ableton in the early 2000s, but when I tried to use loops at the time, I found I didn't want to work that way. When I did start to write music again in 2020, I still found it an uphill slog. Perhaps paradoxically, the relative ease of use that was now available and the myriad of software choices for me were initially creative inhibitors and not enablers. Deleuze says, repetition changes nothing in the object repeated, but does change something in the mind which contemplates it. So what I was used to was by now long obsolete knowledge. Eventually, though, through tentative exploration on GarageBand, I was finally able to revisit the electro-pop songs I had written. The free-to-use software capability was the fixed, repeated, unchanging object, and my brain, and the fear it held, did change through continual revisitation of GarageBand. Through practice research of re-recording my queer trauma songs of the late 1980s, I wanted to test if these DIY aesthetics of analog electro-pop songs written with a youthful mindset could be effectively revisited. Could I ignite the electricity that sparked on the demo cassettes in my cupboard? Should these works be revived, or should they remain the emotionally charged tape-hissing demos? In applying Zagorski-Thomas's three categories, firstly, as an activist researcher, I have a unique opportunity to interrogate a particular socio-political moment. These songs embody the experiential qualities of having my teenage sexuality informed and deformed by societal shaming. As a consequence of what happened, the bullying, the abuse, the constantly being on alert, I would struggle to manage for many years as an adult and in relationships. This music provides recall of that traumatic time and a landscape that I can autoethnographically excavate. Secondly, on a pragmatic level, by making songs in 4/4 time signature on GarageBand, the greatest asset of the software was its basicness. I only used preset sounds, and that way it recreated the limited DIY setup I had at my family home in Staffordshire. In learning how to use GarageBand to revisit old songs, I've also found out how to use a DAW without a time signature and how to extend a limited range of timbre opportunities. Through tentatively increasing my confidence in the repeated use of DAW technology, I started to find a new compositional voice. Artistically, the re-recording of these old songs has been the most uncomfortable of Zagorski-Thomas's categories to consider. Why is that? I have known these songs so long, so is it because I can now not hear them without the hiss, the mistakes, the youthful voice? Are they just of their time and something that is better to be left in the past? What final aesthetics will satisfy me, I do not yet know, but by undergoing this process, I am greatly improving music production skills, taking me from DIY to DAW. Also, this unravelling of a difficult past is assisting me in coming to terms with what happened and helping me reach a sense of peace with lived experience of historical injustice.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to do that. Sound engineer. The themes in the around the questions around the workflow and tools theme were what influenced the workflow and or the tools we use have on our ways of thinking about or doing music, and and how do musical tools embody and create representations of musicking and musical thought. And what struck me about the three presentations was the fact that tools were so kind of central to all three of you, and that you've designed your own, you've been traumatized by having to move between them, and you've been traumatized by having to move between them but over many years, and I wonder if we can maybe kind of dig into the way that workflow fits into that, because the tools are the sort of obvious thing that connects them all, but I wonder if there are workflow themes that also connect them, and I suppose that is both about your motivations but then also what it made you have to rethink or redo or afforded, especially, I mean, with your sort of designing your own, I guess it's about creating the affordances that you want. With yours, I guess it's about finding whether those affordances are still there in the new software that, what is it, is still taking baby steps, was the way. and with you coming at the same material with different tools, how that affects the workflow thing. I don't know. So, well, do you want to go first and just say something about...
This might be a moment to do some actual notes.
Do you want to use the...
Yes, this might be a moment to play some notes as well. This doesn't actually stretch that far. So I very much built this without knowing what music I would make on it. I was thinking about the things I wanted to be able to do, which is tune fluidly and precisely, and what I needed to strip away in order for me to be able to do that. Because if this controller were as complicated as something like, a Moog Mother or something like that, one of those big chunky synths with loads and loads of settings, I wouldn't have the mental space to be doing the tuning. So it was this combination of, adding settings but also taking things away. And I've only actually had the final encoders for this, because they have to ship from China and they take a while, for about a couple of weeks. So it's been interesting over this last week, really, getting going. And the thing that I'm doing is I am practicing it without intent. I'm just trying to practice tuning. I'm doing kind of tuning exercises. I'll go up in major thirds and then check to see if I am creating what I expect from that, and kind of exploring. I'm exploring tuning. And it's creating a very, very different way of thinking, because there's this combination of whether I'm kind of orally able to do something, whether something's within my capability, but then also finding out what I like, what kind of turns out sounding right. So I'm going to just demo what this sounds like, because I've been talking about it for a while now. So let's get some noise. So the thing that is appealing about this is that the sensitivity of these dials is, they're extremely sensitive. So I can get kind of scent sensitivity. So that's 1% of a semitone over the course of an octave. So I can have each rotation be an octave and still have complete control of the tuning within that octave. But I can also change it so that that it's not an octave. So I can do this, for example. So now it's a fifth, which allows you to create quite interesting little patterning things. And so this is my kind of workflow at the moment, is playing around with these different spans and listening hard. And I don't quite know when the actual composition will come, but I am kind of just trusting that it will.
So workflow, something that was mentioned in my talk was this idea that actually I learned to read music in Sibelius, and I don't play an instrument. So the way I had my first introduction to music and to musical notation and composing was being in secondary school and playing on Sibelius. And I went through that process for quite a while, and then my teacher was like, you need to actually learn how the notes work. So then I went to a grade 5 theory class with everyone who was prepping to do their grade 5 theory or their grade 5 practical exams. And I was there just like, I love notes. And it was a very, very different kind of route. But that meant that for me, Sibelius was deeply embedded in my workflow and how I thought about music. It also meant that it was compensating for a lot of the oral skills and the traditional musical skills that I didn't have. So things like playback and actually knowing what things would sound like, because I don't have the capacity to sit at a piano and play the notes through even now. And it was actually quite upsetting in a way when I started going into the sort of contemporary music world. And I think especially some people might be familiar with this idea of some people can be really snobby and snooty about playback and that kind of thing in notation software. And I think as someone who really now is very, very keen on the importance of technical skills and fugue and orchestration and instrumentation, and that's very important to my practice and very important to my teaching as well, but making sure that those things that you approach those things with an appreciation of the background that someone has had. And when I heard prominent composers and professors saying things like, well, you know, would you be a composer if you didn't have Sibelius, and you really, really shouldn't be doing this, you should be working on paper first, when I was in a room of people who all were, you know, grade 8 diploma pianists, it was really, really grating. So in terms of the workflow I had, it's, you know, you can imagine it was very, very ingrained. So when I actually came to the point of needing to switch over to Dorico, that combined with my difficulty anyway in kind of managing long-term projects and change and all that kind of thing, it became really, really difficult. And you know, by that point, I was kind of confident with notation in and of itself. I work on paper, and I'm kind of confident in the two, but Sibelius is rooted in my ability to do that. And so when I changed it, it was a real disruption to that workflow, all the shortcuts, everything. And I went into Dorico being like, right, okay, I'm just gonna hit the ground running. I'm just gonna go with it. And a lot of the resources that were available from Steinberg themselves, they put a lot of effort into making those things. They have so many resources, so many things online. But some of them didn't quite work between the different versions of Dorico, and it was all a bit confusing. And I mean, I've literally kind of sat at home and cried to my partner and gone like, I just don't think I could be a composer anymore. I don't think I'm going to learn how to do this. And the nice thing that I can happily report today is that I now know how to use Dorico. So you can get there eventually, but in that whole process, I was teaching people. I was teaching, one of my students has ADHD, and they were having a similar kind of issue with their licensing and needed to change software. And I'd recommended Dorico, but were very tentatively like, give yourself the time. And then I think 10 days before their deadline for their undergrad composition, they said, oh, my Sibelius copy isn't working anymore. Should I move to Dorico? And with the view that they were going to learn how to use it in like 2 days and then go on from there. And I think part of my wanting to be involved in this setting and sharing this perspective is many of us are teachers, many of us involved with younger composers, or we're learning ourselves. And unless we're transparent about our frustrations and our experiences in making those transitions and how that's affected our literal workflow, I think we set up the next generation, and we set up other people to isolate their difficulties and to not necessarily collaborate on a solution or collaborate on finding a better approach. So yeah, that's kind of what I have to say on the workflow front.
So in the late 80s, I would have the synth and the drum machine, and the song that I put the early version on and the re-recorded version on in the video paper was the first song I'd ever written on synth. So and I'd have a limited time every week because I borrowed the synth from a old school friend, but it was just like, do it, keep doing it again, write lots of really crap songs and all that. But 30 years later, coming back into creative practice, it was much easier for me to start with voice and writing, and also my starting point isn't necessarily music, it's about lived trauma. So it was more about what the medium would be for the means. But getting back into music was so hard because and I needed to do things like just write and keep writing and just spend 20 minutes. And it was actually tools like Audacity and GarageBand that allowed me that softly and playing around with sounds. And the thing I've found actually in terms of what I'm writing now, which is very different because obviously at 52 my tastes are very, very different than at 22, so I'm much more listening to experimental and classical music and sound, a much broader range of sound because the whole world has changed. But actually, I've been recording improvisations with a violinist friend of mine, and actually taking those recordings and manipulating that sound, I found more stimulating than electronic sounds. But then I'm only using a limited palette at the moment, and there's a whole world out there that I'm still tentatively exploring. But I have to have little deadlines, so I do like these weekly challenges on SoundCloud, and it's just been really most of them are crap. Do you know what I mean? But then there is a gem, and I've spoke to a couple of songwriters, Dave Ball being one. I heard Tom Robinson talk about this. Write 20 songs and one of them will be good, kind of thing. And I think that's you just have to work, don't you? And there's practice, not progress, kind of thing. Well, yeah, practice is in the progress, or whatever. Yeah, So.
Yeah, I think that aspect of workflow is interesting. A couple of people have talked about that sort of. Well, we were just talking about immersive audio in a different sense, but immersing yourself in a process, which seems to be what you're doing right now, which is, becoming at home, becoming a native in your instrument, so to speak. And Bea, you were talking this morning about kind of documenting by diarising musical activity. I've got another PhD student who wanted to be here today, but she's recording, who has done exactly that of just improvising 20 minutes a day, not as a way to create any materials as such, but as an experimental method. And yeah, I mean, I suppose from a workflow perspective, don't want to preempt the methodologies session too much, but what it seems to me is that kind of noodling kind of process is something that practice research should be really drawing on, that we should understand what noodling does, or whatever you want to call it, but you know what I mean. I wonder if you've got any thoughts on what you think it does.
Yeah, I have
I have a thought on that, because it's right. I completely agree with you that like noodling and playing around is so important. Though I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball into this. My experience as a woman in music technology and working with synth and things like that, we generally share this idea of noodling, playing about, and giving it a go and figuring things out. And it took me a very, very long time to realise that when something went wrong, if it was a bug, or if I came up against something I didn't understand, actually to not be dismissed for my questions on that front, and to, I think, going into that, you give it a go, you noodle about, you build a practice gradually through that sort of play and experimentation. I think sometimes for people who struggle with the confidence in their own abilities, that can be very, very difficult. And the classic example I think of is, and now I know a lot more about computer science and data computer scientists. I think this is just unbelievable that this was told to me. But in primary school, my IT teacher, he was a really nice guy in lots of ways, he was a great teacher, he said to all of us repeatedly throughout our IT lessons that computers are logical, and if something goes wrong with a computer, it's your fault because you've told the computer what is happening. And like, people are laughing at that in the room, because that's, now understanding what I know about code and bugs and understanding, it's like, to tell that to a room of children is like deeply damaging. And if you are a studious girl who takes everything on board, who's been told, well, something's been going wrong with the computer, it took me until I was 21 for someone to tell me that wasn't true. And yeah, so I agree with you that noodling and that kind of practice is useful, but also I think having a recognition of sometimes a framework, or even that awareness when you're going into the noodling, is valuable.
And I mean, I think that's a really interesting and important aspect of just having a daughter and seeing the way that girls are portrayed in, well, everywhere basically, but the kind of boys try things, and if they don't work, they carry on trying and break things, and girls are kind of taught to be good and sort of look after things, and it's, you know, it's a very, it creates a kind of very early problem with that kind of, luckily my daughter breaks things all the time. She's 23 now, sorry. And you got any thoughts on noodling as a workflow?
I think the question of restrictions is really, really important there. And this is a big part of my thinking in creating this. There is, like, none of what this does is particularly clever. I couldn't have made this if it were complicated, because I went into this with zero skills. It is like 4 noises that go up and down when you turn a knob. But the thing that it does for me that I couldn't find something that did was get me off my screen and onto a physical thing where I could have that type of interaction with sound. And yeah, there's very little on here. There's going to be another iteration which will have a little more, but it's fundamentally a restricted sandpit for noodling.
And do you see it as a potential instrument or as a potential way of writing things for other instruments?
So I do have a goal in mind. Indeed, I have some gigs booked in October, so I have to have some music by then. And I'm just kind of trusting that I will. So yeah, I'd like to make a solo set with it. And yeah, it's been funny because I've been kind of, wanting this thing for a while, working on it. And so it's funny kind of now having it and being able to use it. I'll report back on whether it works.
With us all talking there, I was just thinking about Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure. And that's where innovation lies, isn't it, really? And one of the things, and I've always been attracted to outsider art, and that's what I practice myself, really. So there's no wrong thing in that way. Maybe that's a get out clause. But yeah, so I was just thinking about that. In terms of noodling, well, that's been another thing of doing practice research. That's been incredibly valuable for me because, I mean, obviously I'm a special case in the sense that I'm using lived traumatic materials, so that's quite a sensitive thing. So I've needed to the whole point is about being self-compassionate in that practice. But that's allowed me that kind of room, and being reflexive, is such a popular word in academia, but it's really valuable to be able to kind of do that. So just try something out and then think about it and get that kind of peer affirmation in a way, or what other people have been writing or doing. And I've found that a really useful way of noodling in a way. But that's.
No, it's interesting in that I've examined several quite a few practice PhDs now, and I'm just trying to think if I've had any where there's been like a portfolio of screw-ups, which feels like a really strong learning tool, and you'd think that, I keep saying to students, show me the development of your aesthetic by showing me what went wrong as well as what went right, so that you could sort of show forking process is too sort of simple a version of it, but you could navigate that process of developing an aesthetic, because when you make when that happens, then you kind of can identify, if you stop and think about it, again, if somebody was talking about this sort of what the difference between practice and practice research as being the reflective process, that you can say, why is that bad and that good? And I think that's such a key thing in practice research. It's what makes the difference between practice research and autoethnography for me, because you're just kind of explaining your practice in autoethnography in a way. You're not trying to make it, well, you may be trying to make it better, but that's not the purpose of the documentation. Sorry, that's me going off on a completely odd tangent. Should we get some questions from the room? No, we do, because we're recording.
Thank you, everyone. Very interesting discussions, and I think one theme that I'm seeing, and I myself come from a classical pianist trained background, it's that concept of old and new that's really interesting for me. And I wanted to ask Joe, is that correct? So as you create this new tool, which is, I think, fascinating, is there some parallels, as you said, you starting to create it without sort of any preconceptions, pre-questions in mind, but do you reckon you're somewhere affected by the sort of the classical way we are trained? And you mentioned octave at some stage, and octave is another question. Some authentic instruments don't have even clean octaves. We go really, really neat in that. Yeah, that kind of question, relation between where you're at, because I myself also do a PhD, haven't finished yet, but I'm in the process of experimenting with the piano and with a folk instrument, and I'm using technologies as well there, like loop pedal, and I'm exploring the sounds and resonance. I'm very excited about that, the fact that I can do something else aside from continuously playing Mozart sonatas and Beethoven, which I love, but I'm excited about something else. So yeah, does that make sense, this question?
Completely. I mean, I think I have kind of two answers to that, which contradict each other somewhat. So I came up, like most people, learning equal temperament, and that was the only thing I knew for most of my musical life. And this instrument does try to move away from, tries to be a little bit of a blanker slate than some things that I work with. And it was certainly influenced by, for example, Hayam Alami's work with his bit of software called Lima, which orients pitch around a circle, or goes from a point to a line to a circle. And he is really consciously trying to think of kind of transcultural ways of displaying pitch information, which I found very inspiring. But with all that, you've got to be aware of your kind of biases and inculcations. And I think one of the things that I really notice about what I've created here is that I think it's very informed by a certain electronicism, in particular the kind of steadiness and heldness of the pitch, that it creates these very pure and very precise sounds. I think, is a kind of aesthetic an aesthetic hallmark that I have inherited from somewhere, and that kind of plays nicely with basic coding, for example, because it's a integer and it goes up and down, and I don't have to do anything more complicated than that. So, yeah, while there are parts of me that is consciously thinking about kind of challenging some of the assumptions that I've come in with, I've, of course, ended up creating something that's very informed by my background and by particularly the coding tools that I'm using.
Thank you, everyone. It's been really interesting. Georgia, I've got a quick question, and this might be one that you can't answer because I wouldn't know how to answer it. But when you're just like, I'm just curious what you think about this. So when you talk about transitioning from one software to another, how do you define the sort of, what is the transition? Is it still happening? Because you were still talking about how Sibelius is so deeply ingrained in your practice. So I'd just be really curious to see whether you think what the transition is and like whether you can place that. Is it bigger and smaller now?
So it's interesting because I instinctively said, it's a huge part of my ingrained in my practice, but actually I think it's just now it's in sort of the past tense. It's more ingrained in my creative identity more so than my practice. But I think there is something that's interesting about how long is a piece of thread, piece of wool, string. How long's a piece of string? when you're making that transition, there's a reason, because I was thinking about how I articulate this. And so in the title of my talk, I called it the primary software, in that it's the primary platform or the primary software that you're using to work in. And I suppose it's finally going, like, you know, when you decide to, be a vegan or something, and you like gradually, you transition and you eventually, and then you arrive at a certain point and you've finally given up dairy. And I feel like it's a similar kind of thing of like, okay, well, maybe I've still got some ongoing projects in Sibelius. I've got some things in Dorico. I think that for me is the sort of the transition, the in-between. How do you arrive at that point where the other one is the primary space, where if you want to create, if you want to write a score, you're going to the computer and saying like, all right, I'll open Dorico, that's your instinct. And I feel like when you've arrived at that point, that's sort of what I was meaning in that transition. But, you know, for people who are working between tools or using different things for different contexts, it might be a matter of just actually gaining those skills and getting to a point where you are confident enough in that area. But I think when you're a creative who is very much based in like one thing, one area, it's the transition is getting to the place where you can carry on doing your job as was before in the new thing. But yeah, no, thank you for asking that, because it's very useful to think about.
Oh, thank you. Do you want to go? Who's okay? Too many people at once. Thanks for really, really fascinating discussion. I'm really interested. It kind of links into questions we've had already about this question of creativity and workflows in terms of both software and hardware, and how much they enable things and how much they sort of restrict things. So it's really set my mind going from a really fascinating paper I heard at a conference recently, which was from a guy called Andrew McPherson, who's an engineering professor at the Imperial College London. And he gave a paper called Digital Musical Instrument Design as Critical Engineering Practice. And he talked about how he runs a course on building new instruments, basically building new digital instruments. And he talked about how he finds problems in what his students do, in that they set up self-fulfilling prophecies. So they come up with an idea of what sort of music they want to make, which is influenced by the music they like. And then they come up with a set of parameters that kind of are the sort of things that they're interested in doing. And simultaneously they think, so these are the kind of bits of software and hardware that I'm working with. These are my gates, these are my outputs, these are my variables, and I just map one to one. And I map my variables that I have to hand with the aesthetic parameters that I like, and it kind of fills itself. So while it does the job very well of presenting a digital version, or whatever it is, a creative version of that sound, it doesn't do anything new. It just does what they were going to do all along. So if you give me just a second, he's in his own abstract, I just found it briefly, he says, he proposes that instruments should not be viewed as self-contained objects at all, but as entanglements, complex and irreducible webs of relationships between humans and things. And I'm wondering that also extended to software, not just objects, this idea of what is this, how you see your relationship. Do you see it as a self-contained object, whether it's Sibelius, whether it's a modular synth, whatever it is, or do you see it as this kind of entanglement, this ecology, if you like, of a network between yourself and something else?
I'd like to pick that one up, actually, because I think that was the thing why I was so bewildered with new technology, because the possibilities are endless. And actually, the restrictions I had were ones that I'd gotten used to, but when you've got 4 tracks on a cassette machine, or so many takes, or Cubase, which I used in the 90s, which was a very long and arduous process and quite technical, to be able to actually... The thing I found getting back into creative practice was that I would have to put have a certain amount of instruments, limit myself to 3 or to a certain amount of time, and that seemed to be I was craving those parameters kind of thing too. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. All the idea of entanglement and enmeshment. Yeah.
I think one thing for me about it, having transition between many software and hardware systems since 1983, is that seeing other people doing it as well, in working in studios where you get people going, "Oh, I can't stand this newfangled Cubase," and those kinds of things, was how much people's personalities alter the way that they deal with those entanglements. And I'm very much a person who looks at the stuff and thinks, it's not quite how can I break it, but how can I make it do the thing that it says it can't do? And I've always found that as a really good way of sort of exploring, like you were saying about exploring the possibilities of the. Does it have a name? Hyacinth. It does have an. I remember now. Sorry, from the video, of exploring the possibilities of Hyacinth. My immediate go-to thing. But I know that that's a very personal thing, and I used to get work because I would read manuals, and other people wouldn't read manuals, and they'd say, "I'll pay you to come in and read the manual and show me how to do it."
They are terribly complicated, aren't they? Because somebody gave me a task. I mean, it is like from the 80s, and it's you need a physics degree to understand
they were written,
the manuals of the time.
It must have been the sort of beginning of Google Translate, translating Chinese directly, or Japanese rather, directly into English. They were impenetrable. I just had the kind of mind that could do it. So it was a very different process. Mira, did you have your? Sorry, I'm immediately realising I'm talking too much. So
I did have a.
Oh, and James as well. Sorry.
I feel like I'm going to ask the third part of your question. It's a quick one, but you were talking about like hardware and software and the entanglements, and I'm interested in the bodies that are sitting there. And what's so great about this session is that suddenly, in contrast to maybe earlier discussion, suddenly I'm really like seeing you all sitting there doing this thing. You're real people, And so I suppose this is making me think is that workflow isn't something that you do with your body, but that happens within your body, right? So for me, that opens a kind of epistemic dimension of the whole discourse around using the softwares, which is really exciting. But I'm wondering whether you could comment on that embodied dimension, and specifically how I kind of see with each of these projects how you're kind of grafting one field of technique onto another by changing a parameter. And maybe if you could just comment on that embodied dimension of those changes.
I might grab first because I actually also want to then tag on a question for you on the end of mine, part of the motivation for this was in a way a frustration with previous more embodied feeling ways that I had tried to produce pitch microtonally, specifically singing. And I found that I'm not a good singer, I'm not a trained singer, and sustaining even pitch was just too difficult for me to be able to do the other things I wanted to do at the same time. And I either had to concentrate really, really hard to have control over my voice. And if I was concentrating that hard on that, there was not a chance that I could think critically or in a really textured way about tuning. And this, I am finding, has its own peculiarities. And these literally, they spin, right? So, it's creating its own little pathways at the moment, which is quite fun to find out. The thing I wanted to ask you about, so I also made the Sibelius-Dorico switch, also had Sibelius from a very young age as a very dyspraxic kid that really struggled with instruments early on. And I switched, and listening to your talk, I was wondering, I don't remember it being hard. And then I was like, well, when did you do it? When did you switch? Oh, yes. So I switched very shortly after a very severe car accident. I'd been hit by a car, and I was in a hospital bed and then my home bed on very, very large quantities of morphine. And I was learning to walk. So I think the idea of rerouting how my kind of physical interactions functioned was, it was kind of all the rage. But one of the things that I did notice, and I still notice, is the ingrainedness of shortcuts. Yeah. And that's had real it just doesn't go away. And so I wanted to ask you about that, about, you know, how you're finding the physical transition and also what kind of sonic impacts you've detected on your own work.
Right, you're all going to have to help me out with this because I'm keeping track. So we've got entanglement, we've got so mirror, this idea of being like bodies, and it really tied on. Thing I wanted to say about your point about entanglement is completely that idea of, I think it's not that the tools for me are these physical objects, but that the workflow is embodied with how I am as a composer. And it just so happens because I don't have an instrument to play, Sibelius is sort of my instrument, and that's how I'm playing all the instruments, is through this software. And I think part of the reason it was so personally and emotionally just demanding and difficult to make that transition was because that workflow is kind of part of who I am. And I think in music specifically, or in any kind of arts thing, it's not just a kind of a 9-to-5 job. It's, you know, so often, healthily or unhealthily, it's very attached to who we are as people and how we identify in the world as being creators and being artists. And I think when a workflow is so tied up with who you are, if suddenly that is cut off or you have a difficulty with it, you can't be that body, be that person, be that creator. So I very, very much think about it in this sort of entangled way that brings with it so much kind of great potential for flow, but also difficulty. And you're asking me about, so the idea of actually having that time, I was wondering where you were going with this, because it's like, it's the ideal sort of setting, and I talk a little bit in my video about other industries and how they might approach it, and something like computer science, when you have to transition programming languages or software, you get like structured training that's paid in a job, and you have that length of time. And in a weird sort of way, having to be in a hospital bed and make that transition, you had this open-ended amount of, or this chunk of time without interruption, where you didn't have to worry about other projects, paying the bills, that kind of thing. And I think that's one of the difficulties as freelancers when we make these changes, is actually we don't have the financial security to lean back on, or the corporate structures that other industries or sectors might have to make these software and workflow transitions. And they've got it down to a fine art because there's a lot of money to spend, but there's also a lot of money to make. And when you are an individual, it's much more difficult to utilize those kind of things. On the subject of shortcuts, I'm very glad you brought this up, actually, because something I really, just my top tip of the day, shortcuts, really difficult, and especially if you think of someone with any kind of, like, so dyspepsia, me also, with ADHD, you're thinking short-term memory, working memory, really difficult to remember and make those transitions. Shortcut keyboard covers, ladies and gentlemen, are God's work in this world. There's a company called, I don't work for them, they're not sponsoring me, KB Covers, which is in the US, and they have them for all different kinds of computers and systems and things. You can get them individual stickers, or you can get nice little silicone ones that run over. Even when I was using Sibelius years ago and I got a KB cover, my own flow within Sibelius got so much better, because if you have any kind of memory issue or any kind of physical issue, having that visual cue and reminder constantly of like how you do things set me onto so many different points. And actually, once I actually remember to order it, I think it will be very, very helpful when I'm in Dorico to be able to do that thing. One thing that is really good in Dorico, that if you use it, is that they have this popover feature where you kind of have the same route to get to everything. So you kind of go command, I can feel it, but I can't see it. You do a sort of basic command, and then you sort of type in a shortcut of what it is that you want. And that's really useful compared to Sibelius. It was really weird, like you had to press Command E to get dynamics. It didn't really make any sense. But
the number of times that I still press Command E
I know.
for dynamics.
And what does it do? It does something really weird, like just when then back to front. I can't remember what it does, but I know exactly what you mean. Keyboard covers it, everyone.
And I mean that thing of going back to old systems after you've left them and doing either the wrong keystroke or suddenly getting that memory of, oh yeah, this is the most natural way of doing that. Why did I think it was ever better doing it the way that my new software does it? I've done this for 5 years and I miss you, hand movement.
Joe, with you talking about the hospital stay there, I'm thinking about Joni Mitchell, and she had polio, and she was, I think, in bed for a year or something like that, and that's when she invented all the guitar tunings that are just so extraordinary. I hope that's not an urban myth, actually, but going back into the embodiment of where that sound comes from, it was a really interesting question. It made me think about Simon's categories, actually, and the easiest for me to look at my own work in the past and in the present was about activist and about that feeling of things, of that thing of identification, that why I touched on early on in the paper about my influences, and very unfashionable word, but they're all present for all of us, kind of thing. And when I write, I know that I'm always playing around with major thirds and minor thirds and things like that, and that returning to the likes of Joni Mitchell and those things that are those things that gave those feelings and those senses of comfort, I think, was particularly my experience, and still where I'm at, even though I'm writing very different things now.
Hi, thanks. This primarily towards Leon, but anyone else feel free to jump in. Sort of first a bit of a statement and then a question cum provocation. What you were saying about the working with the simplicity and coming back to these things, it reminds me very much of the state of queer video games at the moment, how there's a big reliance on pixel art and visual novels and easy coding like that as a way of staying out of large-scale developers and being able to work yourself. But even within this, there's a way to queer the software itself, and this extends into art design, narratives, and also audio and soundtrack design. And you were talking about your relationship to your past self, past practice, past trauma, as a reflection or a return or like that. And you brought up Palmerston Queer Art of Failure. And while you're talking, it reminded me a lot of his idea of queer temporality, and that the queer experience of time is a lot more extended than the straight experience, that what could be in our present is a lot further away, and this includes past trauma, past memories, the feeling of being swept up in large-scale political movements, the way relationships with older people often skip generations because of various periods of dying out. And I'm just wondering, to what extent do you feel it is very much a return to something locked in the past versus a way of accessing something, yes, in the past, but still very tangent to you?
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. I mean, there's a process of healing, basically, that's going on. It's a quantum fixing, really. So trying to go back into the past, and that's the major motivation, I think, in terms of doing those doing that. Doing my practice in lots and lots of ways, but also out of having, because I only went back into practice 3 years ago, something like that, and it's quite tiring doing trauma as well, So actually, one of the things that's quickly starting to emerge is actually about doing a lot more softer and just making music and sound and works in different forms and everything that contain more beauty and are still going for an embodied feeling and in a creative process that excites me, but it's but in dealing with the queerness of it, I don't experience a lot of queer joy with it because that's what I'm trying to do is kind of shift that past somewhat in that, because it was difficult and there are various things that got stuck within that really. So it's a kind of creativity as self-therapy there, and that's why I use autoethnography as a self-compassionate thing, because then I can look at things objectively, hopefully. Even though, of course, it's subjective, but at the same time, I can contextualise things, really, and that's why I use that kind of approach.
I was just wondering whether the fixed systems are important. You started off with 4-track with digital synth, right? I mean, the Alka was an FM
it was an
synth.
analog synth, yeah.
But I think the picture that you gave was a...
It could have been the wrong picture.
Yeah,
it was a really rare synth, actually, the Alka
EK44
synth.
or something, was it?
Yeah.
It was a kind of FM synth. It was kind of a post-Yamaha DX7 synth.
Yes, it was. Yeah, we were about 8.
And it was a real pig to program, from what I remember as well. Yeah, there's sort of lots of kind of menu diving and
yeah.
So that's not the most immediate instrument to use, perhaps, but
no. But I mean, even then, at that time, it's kind of this is that time of the second waves of synths. So synthesizers were becoming affordable, weren't they, for the likes of Depeche Mode or Daniel Miller and all of that kind of thing. But me and my friend would still only afford one 4-track, one. You see what I mean? Because it would still be like a very expensive thing. I mean, the Tascam cost the same as it cost me to buy a reconditioned one recently, and it was £400, which was a hell of a lot of money at that time, so a lot of pocket money. So
I mean, but it was a fixed system. So basically, it's a system that you can learn, you can treat as an instrument within itself, as a kind of ecosystem. And equally, I think what you've got is you're designing an instrument there. You're designing something which is fixed. It's got a fixed number of hardware controls so that you can then obviously change the dimensions of it, but it's basically going to be used as an instrument that's fixed. So we've got this interesting idea of where something becomes fixed and becomes learnable as a system over time and doesn't change radically, although you're talking about changing yours, which is going to mess things up. But effectively, you've got this system that you can learn, treat almost like an acoustic instrument, where you learn it and get dexterity and muscle memory, shortcuts, that sort of thing. All the kinesthetic learning stuff that goes with it. That's quite different to the more open-ended digital instruments that you create in software, where McPherson's written about this as well, and Thor Magnusson has talked about it, where you design digital instruments that exist for one project and then disappear off the face of the earth. There are thousands of ICMC papers or 9 papers where these instruments are developed and then they're gone because the funding's run out, and then they're of no use to anyone else except the person who designed them. I think what's nice is when instruments get a life of their own and develop a user base and then mature as a system whilst remaining fairly fixed in nature so that people can actually learn them. I think it's one important difference between the hardware aspect of the way of working and the this endless software development, endless rejuvenation of adding features and improvement. So I just wondered whether that was a factor. Obviously, with software-specific trauma, I get this all the time with students saying, I can't possibly learn Ableton because I love Logic. They've only been using it for 3 years, but it's become part of them.
It's interesting because what you've just said has completely made me understand why I love working with modular synth as well, because it's sort of almost an off-grid thing. You're away from the sort of software related trauma has arisen mainly because of everything changing, improving. And if I could have just kept the Sibelius version I had at a certain point and it didn't start interacting and messing up with my OS, and then I didn't want to update the OS because that was going to mess up Sibelius. And some people who've just woken up one day, their computer's updated, and then suddenly their Sibelius copy from Sibelius 4 or something is just gone. And there is something really beautiful about having an analog system, an analog thing that is just, plug it into the wall and no one can get at it. Like no kind of amount of internet automatic updates. Nothing can mess with my parental neutron. It's there. So yeah, it's a real difference and something I think is worth considering.
To design this, I've been watching a lot of like online, like YouTube videos, both like technical videos, but also just for inspiration about like synth design. And I've become very interested in this idea of like, what's the difference between an instrument and a computer? And the kind of, the DAW to me feels like a computer. Its possibilities are just almost inconceivable, and it thus resists being an instrument in a way that I feel that something like notation software resists less. And it's been interesting, you know, thinking about kind of physical objects that are more computer than synth, or are more computer than instrument, or more instrument than computer, and the way that the ambiguities between those create real frustrations for users. I've become very interested in the online discourse around teenage engineering, if anyone's familiar with teenage engineering, because they're a real Marmite company. Because what they create is so limited and, of course, so expensive. And the price is astonishing. But I do find myself sympathetic with the idea of limitations, with this idea that they're not creating a computer, that they are creating an instrument. It just happens to resemble a computer. And so long as you divest yourself of that expectation of it and take it on its own terms, and that's kind of what I hope for from this. It's pretty basic, but I do hope it can be useful.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, a DX7 is a computer. It's not, you know, I mean, it's just that it's a very limited function one. Adrian?
It just doesn't get updated.
No, thank God.
Hello, thank you. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I work with a load of colleagues in creative technologies whose mantra is essentially that good technology is invisible technology. It should be totally invisible. So I'm just wondering, to what extent are we being slightly self-indulgent here, perhaps, and saying, oh, we're going to let ourselves be engaging with the technology as part of the creative process. So I'm being a bit provocative, obviously, because, yeah, that's kind of the point, isn't it? But also, so that there's that first thing is it a creative or artistic choice to let ourselves be influenced by the technology when ideally society says it should be invisible, or good technology should be invisible? And the second thing is, as a composer, I wonder what extent for all of you, or each of you, pre-composition, before you even come to the creative act, how important is that? Because then there's a tension that's created between the first part of that.
Can I add bullet point C to that?
Please do.
Okay, because the other thing, right, is in musical practice so often is that our bodies are supposed to be invisible. So that's the other side of it. So
Yeah,
can I just put that in the mix to make it more difficult? Question.
Yeah, and I was immediately thinking that, you know, a trumpet is music technology and we don't expect a trumpet to be invisible. Or do we? And I mean, maybe we do. Maybe it's the same as the body being invisible. It's sort of, but then in which case, what is it that's visible? Yeah, exactly. Sorry, anyway.
The second part of your question there, and I've got a view on this, for having not written music for 25 years or something like that, but there is pre-composition that goes on, and that's been head melodies. Usually it's about 2:00 in the morning when I need to get up and, you know, use the toilet. But I put them into my phone, and that's been developing actually over the last. It's quite an interesting thing that's happened over 18 months, and now I've got a piano piece in my head, whereas before it was just like a weird tune or whatever thing. So that's that's because of me re-engaging with technology again and going through this mysterious magical thing that is like, well, I'll make some sounds out of some, and the playing and that machine and going for that feeling that Georgia talks about as well, kind of thing. So so that's my perspective on that, is that I always go to something with something, and then I'll play as well.
I'm so taken by what you were saying about good technology is invisible technology, not least because I heard more or less exactly this with the same idea. I recently made an investment purchase on a very nice office chair, and the company came and delivered it in my house with a nice guy who set me up with it, and he was like, the point of this chair is it is invisible. You don't even realize you're sitting in the chair, and that's good ergonomics. And you're totally right that comes back to this idea of it being embodied. If you're a musician or you're in practice where you're predominantly working in a format that it goes on a computer and in that kind of thing, it's your instrument in the same way that if you're playing the violin, you have that connection and that fluency with that instrument. And so, yeah, I think that's almost the frustration, is that that's what we want. That's what we want as creatives. And if we have that in one place and not in another, we have that skill built up, that invisibility, and then suddenly we're going somewhere new and we can see everything and it's completely overwhelming. And it's that thing about choice as well, where if we go into something new, we're not even aware of the possibilities yet. So how do we even make kind of stable progress? And I suppose what Bea was saying earlier about that transition, maybe the point of arrival through transition is that point where it has become invisible. It has become so embodied in, so that you can have that flow again.
Definitely is so important to know about how to use those tools. I really feel your pain, and I know, and great props to all the people on YouTube, usually men in garages in Oregon. But thank God for them, because that's how I've taught myself things. Just to have those tools. They're amazing tutorials, like Joe mentioned as well.
I feel like my instinct is to bristle against the idea of invisibility. I'm not sure I do view that as an end goal. I'm going to have to quite slowly unpick why, though, because it's not formed thoughts, so excuse pauses. I think that invisibility is a very useful thing in tools when they are not at a critical juncture at an important juncture of a critical practice. I probably want my clutch in my car to feel invisible to me, so that I can safely navigate the roads. But that's quite different from something where I'm trying to create art that explores frictions and explores differences, where I think the visibility of the medium is a part of shaping the way that I interact with the ideas. And I think as a composer, it can be easy and often unconstructive to view the sound as separated from its physical sources of origin, whether those be machines, whether those be people, and generally speaking, people operating machines. And as a result, I kind of want to be in touch with that. I imagine if I get to the point of invisibility with this, I'll probably become bored. There were plenty of instruments which are less visible to me than this, but I chose to make this one. So I think for me, for engaging more critically, then that friction is necessary.
Do you think that you feel differently about that because the synth, because you've built it for a certain purpose within that, and there's an investment in the time of things? Because I completely agree with you that you should remain connected to the sound source, the sound thing. In my case, it's musicians. I need to be thinking about musicians, and it's something that I come up against so much with students and with myself when I was younger, of writing for Sibelius or Dorico and writing for the notation software rather than writing for the instrument. And I think my perception of the invisibility feeds positively into that, in the sense that if it is invisible, the fact that the software is there and I'm not thinking about the terrible MIDI sounds of the library or something like that, that I'm able to directly consider the musicians that will be playing it, as opposed to being caught in needing to think about, oh God, this flute sounds terrible. Do you know what I mean?
Completely. And I think that's what I meant by being at the critical juncture of the practice, right? I also use notation software, but it is, while it's deeply ingrained and important to me, it's not the sharp edge. It's not the thing that's doing the work. Whereas I feel like this is something that is more of that kind. So yeah, I guess different stages in the process have different duties.
And I think for me, it's slightly weird, but the idea, invisibility is a kind of metaphor rather than, literal. And the kind of the thing that it makes me think about is Chick Shake Me High and Flow, and my kind of critique of that as a full and all-encompassing explanation of creativity is that, of course, it's not, because flow is the kind of bottom-up version, the stopping and the critical reflection, getting out of flow in order to reflect on what the flow produced and whether you want to do it, whether you actually stop or whether you just, kind of some little switch in your head changes. I think if we're going to take the visibility metaphor, it's a matter of flicking our attention from the thing to the thing that we want to be invisible, to the thing that we are producing, to the people or whatever else it might be. And I think that kind of, it's a big gripe I have with Chick Shake Me High, but it's a big gripe about its incompleteness rather than its usefulness. But yeah, sorry, that's again, I've got a gripe to axe to grind, so I ground it.
Can I just ask
Here.
Can I just ask if, like, when you were saying about invisibility, could it also be interpreted as fluency with those packages? Because in that case, then, the fact that it's got a physical presence probably isn't the thing. And then you could just reflect and pause that process, knowing that you know how to get from that hissing sound to the clarity sound without actually losing anything as well, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's Chick Shake Me High's thing is sort of fluency. It's not, it's sort of somewhere around that.
I just wondered if the panel had any thoughts on pedagogical implementation of this stuff. So it's amazing the amount of times I hear students say things like they're very interested in a piece and then they're told that to run it they need Super Collider, and they're like, oh no, I'm not installing Super Collider. And they're kind of scared of this idea of not even adopting the technology in the first place or not knowing it. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts of where we go from here. Is it that coding has to be part of every musician's education? Is it that all software has to be open source? I don't know. Just wondered if we have any thoughts.
I mean, I have my not a researcher. I'm a composer. That was my first sort of disclaimer. I think when I think about my own teaching and what would have benefited me and benefited my colleagues in composing kind of contexts, I think we all have different preferences and different needs, and I think it's great to have these very specific things, but it goes back to the idea in my talk of like a holistic approach or a holistic instruction. And I think if we are preparing people in education for an ever-changing world and changing technologies and updates and software, and I think giving people sort of the basic skills or an understanding to make, I don't know, it's sort of, I'm really trying to figure out a better phrase, but the classic, like, oh, you teach a man to fish rather than giving him fish, or whichever way that phrase works around. And I think giving people a skill or a parameter, a framework, as I call it in my talk, that a composer could graduate from their 3 years studying and go forth and know that they've at least had like one lecture where someone says, you need to think about how you're going to change your tools or how you're going to change your skills or upgrade your skills through your career, and not just sort of like some light touch thing, but really with robust practical things like you should consider a keyboard cover, things that actually work.
One thing that your paper made me think, and I'm not entirely sure that this is a good idea or a bad idea, but it made me think, what about there being a kind of process protocol like MIDI for doing rather than MIDI for controlling synths, but sort of that the concepts of how we change sounds and control sounds, it makes sense for transportability, if you like, between resources, just in the same way that MIDI allows you to change machines in an imperfect kind of way struck me as a possible way, but it's also, I mean, MIDI took how many giant corporations, how many years to fund it, and
the one I would argue against that, actually, because I sometimes think that I wouldn't say trauma necessarily, because trauma is never a good thing, but being challenged, I think, and having your workflow forcefully changed can be really good for artists. And I keep saying this to students. I mean, I've had the trauma every 6 months of having to deal with new software, teaching music technology for the last 20 odd years, and it is traumatic. It's a nightmare, but I've come to just accept that and acknowledge the good things about it, which are that your workflow gets broader and broader every year. You've got a huge range of tools that you can make use of. You're not fixed to one. Somebody talks about pre-composition, which I thought was really interesting, that you have this fixed idea of what the piece is going to be, and then you try and realize it. Whereas new tools encourage you to sort of reinvent what you might imagine.
But do you think in the process? Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, you know, if you every 6 months you're learning a new software, you're expanding your practice. Do you think that there are things that you have learned in the 20 years that you've been doing that that mean that you're better at approaching it, even if it's from a point of view of confidence and knowing that you will eventually learn to transition the software?
It's basically just, I know that I'll come out the other end eventually.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the difference.
Just age, though, I think.
Is there place for is there unnecessary suffering that we can like prevent if we share that perspective?
actually, I suppose what I think about this idea of the protocol is that it's a pedagogical tool, not any kind of other tool. It's because the shared pain of having to go through all these transitions of software is blunted by the fact that you understand the principles behind it, because you suddenly go, oh, that does the same thing as that thing, but in a slightly different way with a different controller. So it's, you know, or whatever it might be, that you get those kind of metaphysical understandings of what's going on behind the control panel, behind the...
I'm thinking quite a lot actually about Hussein's paper this morning, and coming back to your question, which was that so Lorraine James and how she spent 3 years at Westminster and is also trained in the piano, I think he said as well, didn't he? And then took 3 years to develop her own process, which is about using production as a compositional tool, and and so there's live playing in it, and there's performance, and she's embracing all the kind of glitches and the errors and making that into a kind of sound. I mean, how on earth how do you teach that? I mean, it'd be fascinating if she did practice research, I have to say.
I think you can draw parallels between her and virtuoso acoustic performance. Learning the instrument to such an extent that it's completely transparent.
And it's how do you teach innovation and intuition? Really, I think she really embodies that, I think.
And on that point, we had better stop, because these poor people have to transfer the tech setup to the front of the building so that we could film down there as well. Thank you to the panelists. That was fantastic. And thank you to everyone who asked questions. It was really good session. So if you get lost trying to find the William Barry